Emma was 12, a spirited girl who had an almost magnetic charm. Her auburn hair, often tied in a loose ponytail, complemented her freckled cheeks that flushed easily whenever she laughed. She loved the spotlight in school plays, yet at home, she was a deeply empathetic and artistic soul. Her room was a sanctuary of watercolor paintings and trinkets collected during family vacations. Emma's parents were her rock, loving but cautious, always concerned about keeping her safe. She had one best friend, Clara. The two were inseparable, their bond forged in first grade over a shared love for drawing cartoon animals. Clara was quieter, more introspective, often content to let Emma take the lead. Her family lived just a few streets away in a house that always smelled like freshly baked cookies. Clara's parents, kind but laid back, had a much freer approach to parenting, which sometimes worried Emma and Dad. It took weeks of pleading for Emma's parents to agree to the sleepover. It wasn't that they didn't trust Clara's family. They simply didn't like the idea of Emma being away from their watchful eyes. But Emma wore them down with promises to text every hour and stick to Clara like glue. Finally, the Friday came, and Emma packed her backpack with pajamas, snacks, and her favorite flashlight, a small blue beam she often used during pretend adventures. When Emma arrived at Clara's house, the girls wasted no time diving into their plans. They had a long checklist: makeovers, watching movies, and sneaking cookies from the kitchen after everyone went to bed. Clara's parents waved goodbye before heading to their bedroom, leaving the girls giggling in the living room. But there was something Emma hadn't noticed during her earlier visits to Clara's house. Clara's parents had a temporary house guest, a distant cousin named Matthew. He was in his early 20s and had recently moved in after losing his job. Matthew mostly kept to himself, rarely interacting with anyone. Clara had mentioned him offhandedly, dismissing him as weird but harmless. Matthew had always been a peculiar figure in their extended family. From childhood, he was known for disappearing for hours during gatherings, only to be found staring out windows or obsessively drawing strange geometric patterns. By the time he was a teenager, he'd grown more withdrawn, and whispers of trouble began to follow him. No one in the family spoke openly about it, but everyone seemed relieved when he stayed out of sight. That night, the house seemed quieter than usual, the laughter of the girls filling the space with a warmth that felt slightly out of place. At around 11 p.m., the two decided to head upstairs to Clara's room to watch their favorite movie. Clara's room was cozy, with walls painted a soft lavender and fairy lights strung along the ceiling. As the movie played, Emma couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. At first it was subtle, just the sensation that the shadows in the hallway seemed longer than they should be. Then came the sound, a faint scratching noise, so light it could have been the house settling, reached her ears. She paused the movie, turning to Clara. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara shrugged, brushing it off. "This house is old. It makes weird noises all the time." Trying to ignore her growing unease, Emma pressed play, and the two settled back into their sleeping bags. But the sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from outside the room. Emma's heart began to race. Clara, seriously, what is that? Clara got up, her annoyance clear. She opened the door and peered into the dark hallway. Nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. See, it's probably just the wind or something, Clara said, closing the door and locking it for good measure. Relieved but still wary, Emma tried to focus on the movie. Minutes passed, and the two began to relax again. Then it happened. The doorknob rattled violently, jerking back and forth as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. Both girls froze, their eyes wide with terror. "Clara, is that your parents?" Emma whispered. Clara shook her head. "They never come upstairs this late." The rattling stopped, but before they could breathe a sigh of relief, a soft knock echoed through the door, followed by a muffled voice. It was low, almost guttural, and though they couldn't make out the words, the tone was menacing. Emma clutched her flashlight, gripping it like a weapon. "What do we do?" Clara was trembling. "I don't know. My parents are on the other side of the house." Suddenly, the voice on the other side of the door grew louder. It was laughing now, a deep, hollow sound that sent chills down their spines. The doorknob jiggled again, more forcefully this time. Emma turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of Clara's fairy lights. They huddled together, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Standing there was Matthew. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but his eyes gleamed with a terrifying intensity. He stepped into the room, muttering to himself, his hands twitching at his sides. "Are you in here?" Clara managed to squeak out, her voice barely audible. Matthew didn't answer. Instead, he picked up one of Clara's stuffed animals from the floor, inspecting it as if it were the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. The girls stayed frozen, too scared to move. Suddenly, Matthew turned to them, his expression unreadable. He took a step closer, and Emma instinctively shone her flashlight directly into his eyes. He recoiled, covering his face and letting out a sharp, guttural sound. At that moment, Clara's parents burst into the room. Her father grabbed Matthew, pulling him out of the room as he shouted for his wife to call the authorities. Matthew thrashed and screamed, his voice echoing through the house. Emma and Clara sat in silence, too shaken to speak. The night was a blur after that. Clara's parents apologized profusely to Emma's parents, who came to pick her up immediately. The aftermath was difficult for everyone involved. Clara's parents sent Matthew to live with another relative, but not before ensuring he received professional help. Emma, once fearless and adventurous, became more reserved. She stopped going to sleepovers entirely, her trust shaken to its core. Clara and Emma's friendship endured, but it was never quite the same. The memory of that night lingered like a shadow, a reminder that even the safest places can harbor unseen dangers. Ava was the kind of teenager every parent dreamed of having. Responsible, studious, and always home before curfew. At 16, she excelled in school, loved photography, and was deeply attached to her family. Her parents, both school teachers, raised her in a small but vibrant neighborhood in rural Indiana where everyone knew everyone. Ava was close to her younger brother Jacob, often spending her weekends teaching him how to take photos with her cherished camera. Her best friend Mia was her opposite in many ways, bold, outgoing, and always seeking adventure. The two had been inseparable since elementary school, balancing each other perfectly. Mia lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by acres of sprawling cornfields. While Ava loved Mia's free-spirited nature, she had always found the farmhouse eerie, especially at night. One crisp fall evening, Mia invited Ava for a sleepover. It was a tradition they had upheld for years, but this time, Mia promised it would be special, a perfect mix of scary movies and stargazing. Ava hesitated. The farmhouse was isolated, and there had been strange stories circulating in the town lately about prowlers seen near the cornfields. "Come on, it's just us and the stars. Don't wimp out now." Reluctantly, Ava agreed. She arrived at Mia's house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cornfields. Mia's parents were heading out for the night to attend a distant relative's party, leaving the girls alone in the house. "It'll be fun," Mia said with a grin, handing Ava a bowl of popcorn as they settled into the living room. They spent the next couple of hours binge-watching horror movies, their laughter breaking through moments of tension whenever a jump scare got the better of them. By midnight, the mood had shifted. The wind outside had picked up, causing the old farmhouse to creak and groan. The sound of the cornfields rustling in the breeze added an unsettling soundtrack to the night. "I have an idea," Mia said suddenly, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Let's go out to the barn. I've got something cool to show you." Ava hesitated, glancing toward the window where the barn loomed in the distance. Its dark silhouette against the moonlit sky made her stomach churn with unease. "What could possibly be cool in your creepy old barn?" Mia laughed. "Just trust me. It's not that scary." Reluctantly, Ava followed Mia outside. The cold night air bit at their skin as they walked the short distance to the barn. Inside, Mia flicked on a flashlight, revealing stacks of hay bales, old farming equipment, and dusty tools. "Over here," Mia said, leading Ava to the far corner. She crouched down, pulling back a tarp to reveal an old Ouija board. Ava immediately stepped back. "No way, that's bad luck," Ava said, shaking her head. "It's just a game," Mia said, rolling her eyes. "Come on, let's see if it actually works." Against her better judgment, Ava sat down across from Mia as they placed their fingers on the planchette. They asked the usual questions, laughing when nothing happened. But as they were about to put the board away, the planchette began to move. Slowly at first, then with more force. "Mia, stop messing around," Ava said, her voice shaking. "I'm not doing anything," Mia replied, her face pale. The planchette spelled out a single word: "Run." Both girls froze. The barn suddenly felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift. Before they could react, a loud bang echoed from the barn doors. It sounded like something, or someone, had slammed against them. "Who's there?" Mia shouted, her voice trembling. And then, no answer. The girls scrambled to their feet, clutching the flashlight. Another bang, louder this time, reverberated through the barn. Then came the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the barn. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room for an exit. "We need to get out of here," Ava whispered. Mia nodded, her usual bravado gone. They crept toward the side door, their breaths shallow and rapid. Just as they reached it, the main barn doors burst open. A figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight, tall and menacing. The flashlight flickered, casting the figure into brief focus. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood. He carried a long, jagged tool in one hand, its metal gleaming in the dim light. "Run!" Ava screamed, grabbing Mia's arm. They bolted out of the side door and sprinted back to the house, the man's footsteps echoing behind them. They reached the back door just in time, slamming it shut and locking it. Inside, they scrambled to turn off the lights and hide. The sound of heavy boots on the porch made Ava's stomach twist in terror. The man tried the doorknob, then began pounding on the door. Mia grabbed her phone and called her parents, her hands trembling so much that she almost dropped it. Her father answered, his voice groggy but alert when Mia explained what was happening. He assured them that he would call the police and head home immediately. The pounding stopped. The girl sat in the dark, too afraid to move, straining to hear any sound. Minutes felt like hours. When the police arrived, they found no sign of the man. However, deep footprints were discovered in the mud outside the barn and around the house. Inside the barn, they found scratches on the walls near where the Ouija board had been. Ava never returned to Mia's farmhouse after that night. The experience left her shaken, her once adventurous spirit dampened. Mia's family installed security cameras and motion sensor lights, but the sense of safety they once felt in their isolated home was gone. To this day, neither Ava nor Mia knows who the man was or why he targeted them. But one thing is certain: the memories of that night will haunt them forever. If you're finding value in this video so far, do me a quick favor and hit that like button below. Enjoy. Lila was 14 and spent most of her days dreaming of being a filmmaker. She carried a notebook everywhere, scribbling down ideas for stories and sketching characters. Her love for movies made her a favorite among her group of friends, who often relied on her to pick the scariest films for their sleepovers. Despite her creativity, Lila was reserved, a trait her parents attributed to her strict upbringing. Her father, a military man, ran their household with precision, while her mother's gentle demeanor balanced things out. Alila often found comfort in her stories, creating worlds where she could be anyone she wanted. Her best friend, Zoe, was her polar opposite, loud, funny, and unfiltered. Zoe's home was chaotic in the best way, with siblings running in and out and a constant buzz of activity. It was the kind of place where silence didn't exist, and Lila loved it for that reason. The two friends were inseparable, bound by their shared love of adventure and late-night storytelling. One Friday night in December, Zoe invited Leela over for a sleepover at her house in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb. The neighborhood was bordered by thick woods, which gave Zoe's backyard a secluded feel. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling every sound and adding an eerie stillness to the air. Leela arrived just as the sun was setting, her overnight bag slung over her shoulder and her notebook tucked securely under her arm. Zoe's parents were out for the evening, leaving the girls alone with Zoe's younger brother, Max, who had fallen asleep on the couch early in the night. The house felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and rustle. But the girls paid no attention, too engrossed in planning their night of horror movies and snacks. By 10 p.m., they were settled in the basement, which had been converted into a cozy hangout spot. The walls were lined with old movie posters, and a faded rug covered the cold cement floor. They dimmed the lights, creating the perfect atmosphere for their first movie of the night. A slasher film that had Zoe screaming and Lila laughing at her friends' over-the-top reactions. As the credits rolled, Zoe sat up, suddenly, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Let's do something scarier. How about we tell ghost stories?" she suggested, grabbing a flashlight and shining it under her chin for dramatic effect. Lila hesitated. "Are you sure? Your house already feels creepy enough with all the lights off." "Exactly," Zoe said, grinning. "It'll be fun." The two began swapping stories, each one more absurd than the last, but as they laughed and teased each other, the atmosphere shifted. Lila noticed it first, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Zoe, did you hear that?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zoe shrugged. "Probably Max getting up to use the bathroom." But Lila wasn't convinced. Max was a heavy sleeper, and the footsteps sounded deliberate, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth. Before she could voice her concerns, a loud thud echoed through the house, causing both girls to jump. "Okay, that wasn't Max," Zoe said, her bravado faltering. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. Zoe grabbed the flashlight, her hands trembling as she shone it toward the basement door. The doorknob rattled, then stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching out for what felt like hours. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she strained her eyes, trying to see beyond the beam of the flashlight. That's when she saw it. A shadow on the wall, tall and distorted, standing perfectly still. "Who's there?" Zoe demanded, her voice shaking. The shadow didn't move. It stayed frozen, its outline sharp and unnaturally angular. Lila's mind raced. The shadow didn't match the doorway. It was too large, too wrong. "Zoe, turn off the flashlight," Lila whispered urgently. "What? Are you crazy?" "Just do it." Reluctantly, Zoe switched off the flashlight, plunging the room into total darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sound of breathing filled the room. Low, heavy, and uncomfortably close. Lila clutched Zoe's arm, her nails digging into her friend's skin. The basement doors slammed shut, and the girls screamed. In a panic, Zoe fumbled for her phone, the screen's dim light casting eerie shadows around the room. She dialed her parents, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. "We need to get upstairs," Lila said, her voice trembling. Zoe nodded, and the two slowly made their way to the staircase. Each step felt like a mile, the darkness pressing in on them. When they reached the door, Zoe hesitated before yanking it open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. As they crept toward the living room, they found Max still asleep on the couch, oblivious to the chaos. Relieved, Zoe shook him awake, but before she could explain, the sound of footsteps returned. This time they were coming from the kitchen. "Hide!" Lila whispered, dragging Max behind the couch. The three huddled together, their breathing shallow as the footsteps grew louder. A figure emerged from the shadows of the kitchen, moving slowly and deliberately. It was a man, his face obscured by a ski mask, his movements purposeful and unhurried. He scanned the room, his head tilting slightly as if listening for something. The girls stayed silent, their hearts pounding in unison. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned and walked back into the kitchen, disappearing into the darkness. The moment he was out of sight, Zoe bolted for the front door, pulling Lila and Max with her. They didn't stop running until they reached their neighbor's house, pounding on the door until it opened. Zoe's parents were called and the police arrived shortly after. Inside the house, officers found evidence of forced entry, but no sign of the intruder. However, they did find a chilling detail in the basement. A single, dusty handprint on the wall where the shadow had appeared. The event left a permanent mark on the friends. Lila never returned to Zoe's house, and Zoe's family installed a state-of-the-art security system. But even with the added precautions, the house never felt the same. The memory of that night lingered, an unshakable reminder of how quickly safety can be shattered. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to our channel for more content like this. Your support helps us keep creating awesome content for you.